This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Brazil, where a panel of Supreme Court justices has sentenced former President Jair Bolsonaro to more than 27 years in prison for plotting a military coup and seeking to annihilate democracy in Brazil following Bolsonaro's election defeat in 2022. A panel of 5 Brazilian court justices handed down the sentence just hours after reaching the historic verdict, which marks the first time a former head of state in Brazil is brought to trial and convicted of attempting to overthrow the government. Bolsonaro and his co-conspirators, who were also sentenced to prison, hatched a plan that would involve using armed forces personnel to assassinate the president-elect, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. The court also detailed attempts by Bolsonaro to cast doubt on Brazil's electoral system, leading to the January 8th riots back in 2023, when thousands of Bolsonaro supporters attacked government buildings. This is the Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Carmen Lucia explaining the verdict.
Fez prova cabal.
The prosecutor's office provided conclusive evidence that a group led by Jair Messias Bolsonaro, compromised of key figures from the government, the armed forces, and the intelligence services, implemented a progressive and systematic plan to attack democratic institutions with the aim of harming the legitimate transfer of power in the 2022 elections.
That's Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Carmen Lucia. We now turn to Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who Bolsonaro planned to assassinate. He said while announcing the sentence that Bolsonaro had attempted to, quote, annihilate the essential pillars of the democratic rule of law state. The greatest consequence would have been the return of dictatorship to Brazil, Moraes said. Bolsonaro has been under house arrest in Brasilia since August and will not be required to report to prison until he's exhausted all appeals to his conviction. Bolsonaro is a staunch ally of President Trump, who described the case against Bolsonaro as a witch hunt, imposing 50% tariffs on Brazil and sanctioning the Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes in retaliation. Trump said he's very unhappy with the verdict and called Bolsonaro an outstanding man. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio threatened the United States would, quote, respond accordingly to this witch hunt. Back in Brazil, opponents of Bolsonaro took to the streets in Brasilia, Rio de Janeiro, and other major cities celebrating the historic verdict. For more, we're joined here in New York by Maria Luísa Mendonça, director of the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil, visiting scholar at City University of New York Graduate Center. Welcome back to Democracy Now! The significance of this verdict and the sentence of more than 20 years for Bolsonaro.
Yes, that's a very important moment. It's a historic moment in Brazil. As you know, Amy, Brazil had over 20 years of a military dictatorship, and the return to democracy was only about 40 years ago. So it's a very young democracy. So that's why it's so important that the Supreme Court in Brazil didn't leave this crime in impunity. So it's very important to set this record and the precedent in Brazil. So we defend our democracy and we defend our democratic institutions, because the attempted coup was not only against the elections when President Lula was elected, but against all democratic institutions in the country, including the Supreme Court.
Talk about exactly what happened back in 2023.
Well, there was a whole, what the Supreme Court showed with the proofs and the evidence was that that was a plot that took over a year. So they described step by step all the ways in which the Bolsonaro and his allies plot this attempted coup that culminated in a mob attacking institutions in Brasilia, the building of the Congress and the building of the Supreme Court, and destroying property. So at the same time, there was this plot to assassinate President Lula and his vice president, Geraldo Alckmin, and Alexandre de Moraes, the Supreme Court justice. So it was a very broad, what they described, what the Supreme Court described was a criminal organization that took several steps to remain in power.
And the significance of the pressure the United States is trying to put on Brazil, the 50% tariffs, who knows what they'll do now. And it looks like very much the identification President Trump has with Bolsonaro. There, it was January 8th, attempted coup. In the United States, it was January 6th. I wanted to go to Trump talking to reporters who was asked about the Bolsonaro conviction.
Well, I watched that trial. I know him pretty well. Foreign leader. I thought he was a good president of Brazil. And it's very surprising that that could happen. That's very much like they tried to do with me, but they didn't get away with it at all. But I can only say this. I knew him as president of Brazil. He was a good man.
So that's Donald Trump. But his opinion is his opinion. But what the U.S. policy is now in putting pressure on Brazil, what that means.
Yes, the U.S. claimed that the 50% tariffs on Brazil was because of trade imbalance, but actually the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil. So it's definitely a political pressure against the judiciary in Brazil. So the Supreme Court didn't take that. At the same time, the Brazilian government took measures to so the economy in Brazil would not suffer very much from the tariffs. So I think the response from the Brazilian government and from the Supreme Court was to say that Brazil is an independent country and is not a colony anymore. So the exact words that they use is that Brazil is not a banana republic. So they stood up, and that was a very important point.
I wanted to go to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva speaking during a televised address last weekend before the verdict in the sentence.
We will resist any attempt to undermine it. The role of some Brazilian politicians who encourage attacks on Brazil is unacceptable. They were elected to serve the Brazilian people, but they only defend their own interests. They are traitors to the nation. History will not forgive them.
So that's Lula.
Yes, I think it was very important that the Brazilian government took measures to protect the Brazilian economy and to protect the rule of law. And at the same time that the justices during the trial mentioned that they would not be intimidated, that a tweet from a foreign government would not change the course of a trial in Brazil where they had vast evidence of the crimes that Bolsonaro is facing now. As
director of the Network for Social Justice, what does this verdict mean for activists, for indigenous communities, for marginalized groups who were particularly targeted and threatened during Bolsonaro's presidency?
Yeah, that's very important because Bolsonaro dismantled several important institutions, environmental institutions, human rights institutions. So that is reaffirming that Brazil is not going to accept going back to a system of oppression and dictatorship. So social movements in Brazil are celebrating, and everyone who defends human rights should be celebrating as well.
And finally, the message to the world around the issue of democracies grappling with the rise of far-right leaders who refuse to accept electoral defeats?
Exactly. I remember, Amy, in 2016, we had this conversation during the parliamentary coup against President Dilma. And at that time, the Supreme Court actually went along with the coup against Dilma. But Bolsonaro...
You're talking about former Brazilian president who was impeached, Dilma Rousseff.
Exactly. So, but Bolsonaro was so extreme, his policies were so extreme that the Supreme Court, the mainstream media, also felt that he went too far. So even those institutions now understand that it's very important to defend democracy. And so I think that all the events that took place since the attempted parliamentary coup in Brazil and when Dilma Rousseff, former president, was impeached, now we feel that there is a conciliation with that history. The recent history, as well as with the 2-decade-old military dictatorship that we had in Brazil that, imposed so much violence in the country.
Finally, are you concerned about the U.S.'s actions right now towards Venezuela under the guise of the war on drugs, the blowing up of the ship, the positioning of U.S. military warships? Do you think that could extend to Brazil?
Well, I think that Latin America needs to be united. Latin American countries need to be united and have a very strong position to defend democracy and to defend our sovereignty and independence. So, and I think that it's very important also to build solidarity with human rights organizations in the U.S. and people who defend democracy here in the U.S. and in Latin America.
Maria Luísa Mendonça, we thank you so much for being with us, Director of the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil, visiting scholar here in New York at City University of New York Graduate Center. Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.